morning, everyone. My name is Georgiana Pongyesva. I'm here from Hopi, Mesa. The village of Hopevilla is where I live, and I have worked in a lot of different backgrounds. But you can go to the next slide, kind of just quick overview of what I have worked in. I worked previously for the last 4 years. I worked with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office with the Hopi tribe. So this is just a little bit of what I worked in, but there's a lot that goes through those offices. They deal with everything under Section 106 with cultural resources for the tribe and consultation, all that. I've also worked with Bears Ears Coalition and on the RMP, the Intertribal Land Management Plan for that. Now moving into Escalante, working with Grand Staircase Escalante Partnership. So it's been really wonderful to connect the landscape. So all over the Colorado Plateau, and I have worked also on with the guide training seminars with the Grand Canyon and on the river as well. So next one. Here's just some pictures of some of that work all over the Colorado Plateau that we have done when I was working with Hopi, and wearing a lot of different hats all the way from so our connections to these landscapes go all over in our migration history, and we emerged from the Grand Canyon at the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River, and we came up into this world which we believe is the fourth world, and we migrated in all four directions all over. And so you'll see evidence of those migrations in petroglyphs, pictographs, architecture, the ancestral sites, even, this is a geoglyph that's out in Green River area. So our migrations are vast, and you can see evidence of that across the Colorado Plateau and even in symbols all over the world. So those migrations are vast, and it's a very deep, rich history that we still continue to be connected to these landscapes. They're living landscapes for us. Next one. So I like to kind of start out with based on my own experience growing up as I'm half Hopi, and then I also grew up in this modern world kind of way of thinking. So I like to say, kind of give a overview of, we're still here, because I know in this national narrative that we have today, you don't often have a lot of access to this information. You don't have often, if you're Native people or that education, I know they've pretty much whitewashed it and erased a lot of that history. I was a history major. I took American history and Native American history at the same time, and they could have been totally different narratives. And it took until I got to college at a Fort Lewis college that was had a very good Native population that I learned, a lot of this stuff. So I knew that I was Hopi, I knew I was a part of this, but then when you're in school, in public school, you're like, where do I fit into this narrative? And I know that's hard sometimes to understand what our connections are and our continuum. So this is the reservations, but at one time we were all over the United States, and the landscapes, there's no borders. They, overlap, and we all shared those places. So this is kind of an overview map of what reservations and tribes are still out there. And the other thing I really wanted to let you know too with the last slide is there are 574 recognized tribes that are federally recognized, so they fall into that government to government relationship, but there also are tribes that are unrecognized who choose not to be recognized because they're exercising that sovereignty. I've met tribes down in Texas that are we don't even want to be federally recognized, and they become nonprofits or different things like that. So and state recognized, so there are different laws and recognitions of how tribes want to be. So each one is a sovereign nation, and we all have different languages, different views on how our cultures, how we participate in our cultures, and different outlooks and land bases, but we all share a similar view when it comes to land and our environment and that spiritual connection that we have. So So in order to kind of understand that concept, which I know is kind of hard to define because we all are so different, it's easy, it's to kind of understand that, kind of break down the Western perspective kind of on religion and land and resources versus the indigenous. So just some kind of different conflicting things is like from a Western religion, perspective on religion, land and natural resources. Religion is often based on written doctrine that can travel overseas or be written by man or used often and sometimes to subjugate peoples or conquer different landscapes. It's also based on constructed spaces that are sacred as long as people gather there, but as you can see, like all over, sometimes churches can be repurposed into different buildings or, torn down or different purposes. So then the view often on land, wildlife, and natural resources is like a commodity, very human-based, a commodity that can be owned and made money off of and controlled and profited from. This idea of domination over nature and then like to create borders and barriers in order to control those landscapes. Next slide. A Native American indigenous perspective on religion, land, and resources. Our spirituality is intrinsically tied to the land, our cultural landscapes, so they're living landscapes. Archaeological sites and things like that are not isolated occurrences, as often archaeologists like to say. Everything is connected. Everything is passed down through oral tradition, so it's in that way, it's like that community memory of that history that is tied to the landscape, which often is like a mnemonic device, like different places, points, like features can be a memory to that story that brings that experience to life for you, and then it's also based on your personal experience that you have with that landscape or that place based on that collective memory. The stewardship of land is not the idea of ownership over, is like we believe that, it's beyond our control and the power is way greater than even we can even comprehend. The landscape, we're linked to sacred sites through language, migrations, oral history, songs, ceremonies, pilgrimages that continue to renew their spiritual power every time you visit them. So for Hopi, like there are shrines all over these places and our migrations, there's evidence of that. So when you go back, there's different clans that come and visit those places at different times a year to renew those prayers. So it's almost like activating that spirituality within that landscape, and they're very powerful in that way. Next one. So we continue to honor oral tradition linked to specific places of significance. Like in Bears Ears, you can see this is Bears Ears, this is Chocolate Canyon, and then even to the ocean, like that story, that collective memory from our migrations goes all over the world. So we even use like those shells, different things, those pilgrimage routes, those trade routes are used within our ceremony. Because when we're praying for Hopi, I know they pray for everything, all life. It's not just about us. It's not just about human perspective. It's about insects, pollinators, different soils, minerals, all the way to the ocean, the life in the ocean. Like that is that memory, and that's what we learn through our migrations. So the whole idea of like, this is a place, even though it's so far from where we are in Hopi, which is in northeastern Arizona. And they say when we emerged and we went all over the world, the ones that completed those spiritual migrations were led back to where we are today in Hopi, on Black Mesa, and it's made up of 3 different mesas. So we never abandon, because it's still in this collective memory, and we still make pilgrimages to those places and pray for those places. So those landscapes are still very active in our culture and spirituality. When we desecrate such places, so that's why, development, mining, road construction, logging, fracking, pipelines, over-visitation, recreation can be very dangerous. I grew up outside of in Sedona, Arizona. Just what I've seen in my lifetime in that area is very disturbing, and that's the things that I do not want to see happen to these places, because once you start that, it just like, you can't stop it. Tourism.
Can you explain in more detail what that means? Once you start that?
Yes, when you open up, and I'll have another slide on that too later, but kind of when you open up to visitation and you open the floodgates, and it's like you can't stop that flood that comes in of people, visitation. It changes the community because your values start to change to value tourism and what other people coming in from other places. Like I know in Sonoma it's like California, and I lived in Durango, it's from Texas. It's like these people who value different things are coming in and changing not only the community but the landscape and putting their idea of what needs to be there on these places, which is often, again, back to the idea of domination over nature, of commodification, of all of that. So that's what I always want to be very careful and let people know, we have to be very, very careful of that because, yeah, it's almost impossible to stop once it starts.
So it's the value.
It's the value, and we'll talk about that more too. So, yeah, well, no worries. And once that, once these places are impacted in that way, you can see it. I mean, like when a road goes through or logged, that being, that spirituality, those deities, those things that live out there, are lost. And so that's something you can't get. For Hopi, that's like Gatsy, the land is my life. That's like our philosophy. In that way, so when this is Hopi Mesa, that's the third Mesa by where I live. And so when we emerged, we were given specific instructions on how to live. And it was to live simply. And there's this, what do you go to the next slide? So we're peaceful people, and we were told to live with respect, reciprocity, humility, and then community, and as stewards of this earth. That was the agreement that we made with the caretaker of this earth, Masa, upon our emergence. And so we still practice those values today. So through our migration history, that's how we left those spiritual markers on the earth. And we still have that in our collective memory, like I said, and revisit those places. And it's almost like it's keeping the earth in balance. So when we go to those places, it's like almost like re-energizing. When you're running those trails, when you're putting your prayers out there, it's like re-energizing the earth. And we think about what's above, what's below, and in all directions. So it's not this just concept of, we think about the groundwater. They say there's things underneath. If it's disturbed, that stuff is going to have an effect. We don't know how far groundwater goes. There's studies, they still don't know how far that happens. Our watersheds, rivers, streams, springs are like the lifeblood of the earth. So when you put like a dam or something, it's like cutting off that vein almost, because that affects all the ecology, like on the river, it affects everything downriver. We as humans have a lot of, power in the things that we do, but we don't understand the consequences fully of those actions all the time. For Hopi, we're located on Black Mesa, northeastern Arizona. It's made of 3 mesas and 12 autonomous villages. So it gets very complicated because each village is autonomous, and then it's all under the tribal government. But then you have 4 villages that are traditional, including my village of Hopevilla, that don't even recognize tribal government. The tribal government was put in place with the Reorganization Act in I think it was the 30s, and they created tribal government in order to have this relationship with the federal government, this government to government. But when traditional societies, they don't see that as the rulers in that way as our traditional villages. So that creates some issues with there's not representation within tribal government of those villages who represent the traditional mindset. So that can cause issues. So that's why the Cultural Preservation Office is kind of in that place to try and represent that traditional view for Hopi when dealing with a lot of this stuff. We were never removed, and we never signed a treaty with the government. So we are in our homeland of where we are. But Hopi Tetswa is like our migration. So our ancestral lands reach all the way across the Colorado Plateau and beyond, and that's how we see that from our migration history. We're dry farmers, so we farm. Everything is based around the corn and the life cycle and the farming cycle of the year, and it's all based on rainwater. So we live out, you can see it's very arid. Everything's based around springs. That's how the villages were founded. But it's that symbiotic relationship, that meditation with the landscape and our ceremony that call the clouds and bring the rain. So you have to have that spiritual connection and that it's almost like a meditation with the landscape, and that you start to, they have the ceremonies to do that, to call the rain, or to the rain clouds, and then also like pollinators are so important, all these things, and that's why the pilgrimages are ways to like renew that spiritual markers and that collective memory. So our ceremonies are intrinsically tied to the seasonal cycles, and like I said, to perform to bring rain and good blessings for people, but all life, not just us. It's all life, all people, and as above, below, in all directions. So we think about like air, like air quality. You know, we don't really think in this. You don't think about that often, but you know, the air quality, we're seeing it changing now. Oh my gosh, I was just in Vegas. It was like, oh my God, this is scary. But that's all connected. It'll blow. You know, we're not too far from these places, and then astronomy, the stars, like you have to think about the protections of these places, because in this modern world, we're getting so far, like we don't know what's going on in space or what they're doing in the sky, but that has a very strong connection to our cultures, because a lot of these sites are aligned to the stars or to seasons or sun markers. These are just some pictures of Hopi. This is like traditionally back in the day, but you can see not too much earth change. This is a spring. The women farm from the spring, so this is terrace gardens, so they use it to the spring to water those gardens, but the men do dry farming. So the fields are purposely away from the mesas, so they actually used to run down there, be in the field all day, and have those ceremonies to call the rain clouds and call. It's pretty amazing to see a ceremony, and it'll be blue sky everywhere you can look, as far as I can see, and then they'll start doing it, and you'll see the clouds start to gather, and then by the end, if it works that strong, it'll rain. But things we don't think about, like seeds, like even today, genetically modified, like things are changing. We don't think about these things, but all these things are very, very important to Hopi. And we have kept our heirloom seeds. There's all different types for corn, beans, squash are the main crops. Okay. These are just some more pictures of Hopi, and then, you know, this Chaco Canyon, and how corn is your wealth. So we have ways of preserving for like years and years of those type of things. So I just wanted to go quickly on some things that are helpful, because I mean, it was helpful for me when I learned about them. It took a while. So, so some policies that I'm sure you guys have probably heard about, but from an Indigenous perspective. So you can keep going on that. So the Antiquities Act, I just want to go over these real quick, and just so you can get an idea of like, these are to protect archaeological resources, but they define us as archaeological resources. So this was first enacted in 1906, and it was a law, it protected sites, right? But it didn't, and it attempted to stop looting on public lands. At that time, people were doing like skeleton picnics, like especially like at Mesa Verde and different things. People would go out and just like, they're called skeleton picnics, and they would go out and they would just collect bones and like pieces of pottery and different things and like take them home, which, I mean, nowadays we're like, that seems very disturbing, but back then it was very normal and okay. This act was driven by the idea of the vanishing rights, which was basically that all Native people would eventually just be erased and vanish into history, and so they better collect as much as they could and preserve it, so, you know, because we would all go away, and so they would know that history through that material culture. We were defined, it was not for anything with human, we were defined as cultural resources. So that even included like collecting our ancestors and putting them in boxes and museums. So we were not really as much as they were protecting. It wasn't we were not included as humans in that narrative. So, that history is pretty gnarly with the vanishing race. They tried to kill the Indians, save the man by erasing culture and taking children to boarding schools. There were actually 12 Hopi elders from my village that were sent to Alcatraz prison at the most gnarly time when it was for the most hardened criminals just for refusing to send their children to boarding school. They would hide them in the cliffs. So you can see like a lot of this stuff was collected, bag, tagged, put in boxes, and then now today we're doing with repatriation, which is a whole nother can of worms, but you can see these things are never supposed to be taken. They're planted, like I said, as spiritual things. There's a reason why they were left. There's a reason for all of that. So that's kind of a little history behind that. The National Historic Preservation Act was 6 years after antiquities. It started to, identify, document sites on the National Register of Historic Places. It's been amended, but however, again, archaeologists and historians rarely consulted with tribes in preservation about the preservation and protection of cultural sites. It mitigates, it doesn't really protect because still our views are not fully understood or taken into account when it comes to a lot of things. So, but it requires the tribes to be consulted, but often it's a box checking thing. And it's like, oh, we fulfilled section 106, we checked the box, but we're gonna still go do whatever we wanna do. The Environmental Policy Act is, because for us, the environment is not separate from cultural resources. We are a part of the environment, so it's important for us to protect that. Often from this Western perspective, you don't see sometimes a difference between cultural resources, environmental resources, but they are the same and they're very important to us. So we are always for protecting the environment because they are all connected to stop changing that idea that we're separate from it. Next one. And of course, the Archaeological Resource Protection Act. It's to address looting vandalism, but again, there's not really that much teeth to it, and trying to catch looters is something that can be very difficult, especially on these vast landscapes. So that's where guides can often be very helpful in that, as stewards and being like just as looking at the landscape, being monitors and reporting, or like just making those observations as site stewards almost of the landscape. But again, we were still not consulted in the bones of our ancestors or these sites. So next slide. And then this one, it was when I got to college, I couldn't believe this, but the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. We did not get the right to practice our religion in this country as the original peoples here until 1978. Like, that was unbelievable to me. But, and it's still very difficult. This also, again, doesn't have as much teeth because it's very difficult for people who, if you don't know, like, how we define our religion, because Native religion is so vast and we're all different and often based on like land, unless you're actually getting those oral histories, it's very hard to define it and to have that teeth under federal policy with that. So, and so, yeah, and just this idea of like, they created national parks, national monuments, they removed Native people from this whole national narrative to create public lands. And so this idea of like untouched, untamed wilderness is a myth. We have always been a part of the landscape. These are human landscapes, these are cultural landscapes, these are living landscapes. And we have continued to be a part of them. That's why this new era of cooperative coast stewardship is very necessary to change that narrative. It's time. And we can work together to be cooperative coast stewards together. We're all in this together. Climate change doesn't discriminate. All of this doesn't discriminate. And so it's time for us to all, work together collectively with our environment to start making those changes. And then finally, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the first human rights law that gave us the rights to the bones of our ancestors. It took until 1990 for that to happen, and it's been amended. But there's issues with it as well, because it does protect and it seeks to repatriate things like objects of cultural patrimony, human remains, and funerary objects unassociated back to tribes. But the thing is, we never asked for any of that to be taken in the first place, and it creates a big burden on tribal offices like TIPO offices, cultural preservation offices, because first of all, the funding is not given really to support what they're trying to do with repatriation. And I worked with 5 major museums like Field Museum, Carnegie, the American Museum of Natural History, where they have these huge collections. Hopi's one of the most studied tribes, and they collected so much. But then where does it go back to? Like, I was organizing according to priority, what sacred objects are priorities to come home. But then you also have to think about, sometimes things were put on display, they were sprayed with arsenic or chemicals. So if you're repatriating that back to a community and they're gonna use it in ceremony, you have to look at those records, and like often if that's the case, we'll have the museum just keep it. But there's things that should be taken care of, like things should breathe, like there's specific protocols that need, because these are living things as well. They're not necessarily these like things that need to be preserved too, because sometimes in our different cultures, things are meant to break down with the landscape. They don't have to be preserved for every little thing to be put in a box and things. And now, so that creates good and bad for our communities when it comes to like the manpower it takes, the spiritual protocols that it takes, and to like rebury that, it's very hard to find people to want to take that on, because that's a whole nother almost kind of like spiritual juju to open that not everyone wants to be a part of. So it can, but it's amazing that it took that long to finally see us as humans that have a right to our own ancestors and dead. So that being said, the traditional cultural property defined kind of gives you a little bit, so it's about that history, but again, it's often looked like a natural feature element in the landscape, so that's why it can be very hard to define under, policy or Western perspective. But a lot of these natural features and things for us in our communities, they're identify our history and traditions, but also are based on that collective memory. So like when you see, say like a butte or something, you can remember that history, you remember that story, and then you also remember how you feel or felt visiting that. So it's like it continues to live on in that way. So it's intrinsically tied to that collective memory and that cultural continuance and spirituality. So here's just kind of some more of that. See, next generations, that's how we continue to spread, to share our oral history and that cultural continuance. And yeah, next one. So everything is about balance for us. It's maintaining this balance within not only like our bodies, we have a balance, and then we have that balance with the earth and our environment. So that's in a Hopi perspective. It's like walking that double-edged sword, that line, maintaining that balance. But they say that we're getting out of balance now in this modern world. There's even a prophecy rock, I should have a picture of that up here, but it shows us emerging and we are in balance for a while, and it shows the Hopi way of life and this other modern way of life. And they parallel each other for a little while. And then this modern way of life zigzags up and ends. And that traditional Hopi way of life continues. And that's like living that stewardship and reciprocity with your environment and community and all of that, and living a good, positive, happy, Hopi life. So that can apply to all of us when we walk in these spaces and on these landscapes. So this is kind of just, you'll probably see a lot of these when you're out on your guiding trips, just to kind of give you an idea of, what kind of sites or TCPs or traditional cultural properties is what they're called. You see, Karens. These are, for us, our clan markers often. A picture looks like this, like shows the snake clan went through there, which is a very powerful clan. So you'll see that, or the spiral is our migration symbol. So you can definitely see like how far they were on their migrations. But the spiral, sometimes it'll point in different directions, the ways they traveled, and there's stories that connect to all of these things. So they all have purposes. So visiting with respect. So these landscapes are very powerful. And I would suggest to you as guides, I was always taught when you're going out into these places to just, even if it's just in your head, to just say a prayer and let them know you're there. And they're passing through with a good heart and good purpose, because they're very powerful. They can take life and they can give it. I'm sure we all have had that experience of like rejuvenation, feeling healed through these spaces, but also like, you never know when a rock can fall or a flash flood's gonna happen, or you just, they can take life like that. So there are consequences to things like taking home pottery or, shooting holes. You'll see the desecration that happens all over. Running over a site with an ATV, all of that can have consequences, and some of it can be, and we'll get to the next slide, I guess we'll talk about that, but there are consequences for it. So when you go out there, leave no trace. I'm sure you guys all practice these things, but the other thing I would like to bring attention to is including posting and geotagging. Because like we see in spaces like Moab, Sedona, loving places to death, when you're posting or you see people in your groups posting and geotagging, you're inviting the whole world into this space. And when they put instructions online or whatever, it's just like opening it up. And like I said, once you open the floodgates, it's almost impossible to stop. It changes the values, it changes the reverence of the space, it can have irreversible damage. The values, all of that. So I would just say be very, very careful of, with your visitors or letting them know like this is something that we should definitely include in Leave No Trace, which is not leaving the instructions on how to get there or opening it up to the whole world to come and inviting them. So, and taking nothing, leaving it alone. Dangers of misinterpreting archaeological sites, pictographs, and petroglyphs. It's dangerous for us because it changes our history and our connections. And it's basically, so many books have been written by people who are non-native on these places, often include a lot of false information. So it can be very dangerous because you're taking on that to try and interpret something that you don't understand necessarily. And so that's why I would suggest, like, if they are to learn more about that, maybe invite a Native person out with you from that community if you want to learn more about it, to speak to that. Or we could, work down the road. I know Grand Canyon National Park is working a lot with developing guide books from Native perspectives that, we have worked with the different tribes to put together something for guides to talk about the river, talk about the rim. Maybe we could do that for Escalante, but that's, approved by Native people. But just don't interpret it if you don't know. You could talk about, our connections and migrations. This is how we measure our history and our cultural continuance, but don't try and get into detail about trying to interpret it. A lot of things. I've gone out to Bears with elders, and they call it Wolfman panel. Because archaeologists are just making up stuff unless you're talking to Native people. Like, that's really, the bottom line. You're playing a total guessing game and missing the total huge portion of the puzzle. So, like, I went out to this site, the Wolfman panel, and they're like, the elders are like, that's not a man. that's a woman. That's the mother of the hunters who you pray to when you go hunting to ask her to help you show the animals. Like, she's wearing, you know, a mata. So that just goes to show like how much gets interpreted by archaeologists, which are just like so out of left field. And if you talk to an actual Native person, it's like, what are they talking about? Like, that has no connection. So I would encourage you, if you can, to invite, you know, Native people or communities, or, you know, we can make that happen in different ways. There are ways that we can work together down the road, but just try and stay away from interpreting our sites, because it can lead to issues for us down the road too. Be a steward of the landscape. We all have that responsibility. We all can be stewards in our own way. And I know that just you guys know the landscape very, very well. You've been out there to most places that a lot of people don't go. So your eyes are crucial in just keeping a record of just, you know, what is being disturbed, what is being impacted, from the cultural sites to the ecological impacts that are taken, often with over-visitation, different things like that. Water is very sacred to us. Sometimes you wouldn't even know it's a site. Like shrines, they look like, honestly, rock piles to the untrained eye. So just visiting with respect and understanding there are those things out there, and just tread lightly. And don't take things with you, because we'll talk about that now. So consequences and taboos. So for us, that's what they say, taking stuff, desecrating, destroying. This was in Bears. We saw ATVs going over these sites. It's a huge, massive site. This is looting in Bears Ears. You see holes and different things. Sometimes you'll find stuff like this out there. Don't take it home. There are consequences. I did my field school at the Petrified Forest. There's a whole exhibit out there on petrified wood of people who took petrified wood and sent it back because bad luck. People get really sick, like from cancer to kidney to blindness. Like, there's all these different things. There's stories of all kinds of stuff, like to death, that can follow with you. Also, they say sickness or death, people, it might not affect you necessarily, but the people around you, or the innocent people around you, like children or pure-hearted people. But sometimes when you take those things, it'll start affecting those innocent, pure ones in your life. Often, there's a lot of stories about nightmares and hauntings. Even like they say in Hopi, you're not supposed to carve certain kachinas or paint certain things, like palanghoya, which is like a water serpent. There's a story I know of someone who was going to the Indian school, the art school in Santa Fe, and started painting palanghoya, the serpent. And he started hearing water at night, and it was like haunting him. And then I think one of his elders or his uncles told him, you can't be doing that. And so he had to destroy that. And that stopped. But that's the same thing that happened with like Zuni. There's a story about, you know, because even our own tribal members sometimes do have done things, and it'll haunt you. It'll come for you. And then sometimes it ends up in people taking their own lives. So this is a very real thing. It's very, very common. And so I would just warn you about any of that. It's not worth the risk. And also unforeseen accidents out on the land and other places. Like I said, you can never know. The things out there are very powerful. So that's why visiting with respect and that reverence is very, very important, and leaving things as they are, because and that's some heavy juju that, I mean, back in the day, they would go to a medicine man, but nowadays there's not many left. So this is some powerful medicine that I would definitely, I mean, there's even things like being things affected by snakes, like a snake site, people feel choking like around. So these things are real, and so just be aware of the consequences and taboos that can follow you when you affect this. So next slide. This is one of the most powerful sites I've vintage out in Green River, and that's like, I just talk about taboos. It just felt like a very taboo place. But there's just very, like a lot of just very crazy things going on in this petroglyph panel, but monsters and debauchery and a lot of different things, but you could feel the energy out there. And sometimes when you go to these sites, you can feel it. I don't know, you can feel heavy or kind of sick or nauseous. So if that's sometimes the case, I would just say, and you can carry tobacco, like I always carried tobacco, or Homa, what we used was white cornmeal, but even just saying a prayer and like backing away and being like, okay, I realize I'm not supposed to be here, please, I respect that, and don't follow me home with me. Just kind of acknowledging that sometimes can be even, you can feel it. So what do we value? I know each of us value something, like we all have these connections to the land, and we have our own values as individuals and collective communities. So I would just encourage you to just think about that when you're out there, and what do you hold sacred? I mean, we all obviously have a stake in these landscapes and want them to be protected and taken care of in the proper way. And so I just encourage you going forward to just think about it in a different lens sometimes when you're seeing it. And I hope that as we continue to move forward in cooperative co-stewardship and the management of these landscapes, and as guides, that we can be more inclusive together, working together with Indigenous people and Native people. And, because we all have value in this. We all have that. And we all want it to be continued and held pristine as well as we can for future generations. Climate change does not discriminate. And we're at that point, we're at a turning point in our history as humans on this earth. I think it's now or never. So I encourage you going forward to just hopefully keep this in mind and visit with respect. Oh yes, and then just some tips for working with tribes. What you need to understand working with tribes is, partnerships and collaboration. It's built on building lasting trust relationships. So especially from government officials, like there's a lot of wrongs that have happened from the federal government when coming to tribes. So, building those trust relationships as humans to human, friendship to friendship, and then, understanding this policy, incorporating that. But that's huge. And then understanding the cultural attitudes and tribal protocols. If you're going onto tribal land and reservations, like you're entering another nation. It's almost like a different country, and there are specific protocols, sensitivities, and cultural aspects to be understood. So just be respectful of that. It's not always, and it can't be learned from textbooks or field manuals. You have to have those human connections and relationships. It's always best to meet face to face, because again, it's about building that, and confidentiality is huge, respecting that. And then again, with consultation under Section 106 and stuff, don't be a box checker. Actually, we're all in this together. Don't just go get your, I consulted with Hopi, check that box, and then go do whatever you're planning on doing originally. We are in this together. We need to work together. Listen and learn. So always good at listening when you're going to these communities, because that's how you learn. That's something I had to learn. Give credit where credit is due, especially when writing reports or papers, scholarly that. If you're getting information from Native people, Indigenous communities, give them credit for that. You cannot just take that and put your name on it and profit from that. It's time for that. That's where reciprocity comes in, and respect. And the last one, it says, every tribe is different. Remember that. We all have different languages, cultural views, and spirituality, but we all have that basic still concept of our earth and our environment and our spirituality. And then everyone likes to eat. It's always, whenever you're having meetings with tribes, food is a main source of us coming together, sharing that table and that communication. So it's always good to have food when working with tribes too, make sure everyone's fed and happy. So, and that is just some tips, yeah, to go out and learn by. So, great. Thank you, Escalade.